Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. This video is going to be comparing the US and UK executive branches. So essentially we are going to be comparing the US President to the UK Prime Minister. We're going to be looking at their roles, we're going to be looking at their power, we're going to be looking at different theoretical approaches. This is part of my A-level politics playlist and also part of my US politics playlist. I'm aiming to cover the whole of the A-level specification as I teach it, so if you've not subscribed already then please do turn on notifications, and as I add more and more videos then hopefully there'll be plenty on there to help you with your studies, with your revision or whatever else you're doing. Otherwise, if you're just interested in UK and US politics, I hope this will give you loads of useful information and show you some of the similarities but also some of the significant differences. So this is based on the edXL A-level politics specification, and it's two parts of the spec. 6.2.5 compare and debate the following aspects of UK and US executive branches and the resulting impacts on politics and government. So key similarities and differences between the role and powers of the US President and the UK Prime Minister and the impact on politics and government, extent of accountability to the US and UK legislature. And then 6.2.6, the extent to which rational cultural structural approaches can be used to account for these similarities and differences. So we can do all of that. Now, to start off, I'm going to look at the executive branches and their resulting impact on politics and government. Well, to do this, we need to look at how they're different in a range of different ways. I'm going to start off by looking at some of the constitutional differences. So the Prime Minister is an MP. Usually the leader of the largest party, and one of the weird things this means in the UK is you can actually become Prime Minister without winning an election. So May became Prime Minister before she won an election. Johnson became Prime Minister before he won an election. Brown became Prime Minister without winning an election and then lost one. So he was Prime Minister for a period of time but never actually won an election. It doesn't happen in the same way with the US President. To become US President you have to be elected by the people. It's a separate election from the legislature. The only real exceptions you get to this is if a president dies in office, then their VP will become president, as happened with Johnson following on from Kennedy, and a different Johnson following on from Lincoln. Or if the president is removed or resigns, as happened with Nixon. Now, this is a constitutional difference, and that the key bit behind this is this separation of the legislature from the executive in the US, which doesn't exist in the UK, because the UK has got this kind of fusion of powers where cabinet and prime minister come out of the legislature. In the US, you've got separation of powers where actually the president and the cabinet cannot be members of the legislature. So that separation gives a key constitutional difference, and it has a lot of impact later on, as we'll see, in terms of power. Now, one of the bits that the British Prime Minister then immediately comes out against is the fact that their legislature in the House of Commons can actually remove them through a vote of confidence or vote of no confidence. And they usually have a majority, and therefore a vote of no confidence is very unlikely to pass. The president is not dependent on a legislative majority at all, and often faces what we call divided government, when you have the president of one party and at least one of the two houses, either the House of Representatives or the Senate, being controlled by the opposite party. So, for example, from 2018 to 2020, you had a Republican president in Trump, but the House was controlled by the Democrats, and then the Senate was controlled by the Republicans. So you had divided government. No party had all of them. When we go into 2021, we now see Biden, Democrat, in the White House. We've got a Democrat-controlled House, and we've got an equally balanced Senate. And actually, that means that the VP, Kamala Harris, has the deciding vote. So essentially, the Democrats have got a united government at the moment. Cabinet plays a key role in restricting the power of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister in the UK is the first amongst equals, which means that that when cabinet makes decisions, it does so collectively, and they then rely on their party, the parliamentary party, to pass any legislation through the Commons. And members of cabinet can prove to be quite strong rivals for the Prime Minister's position, and sometimes Prime Ministers take the decision that it's better to have your enemies close than it is to have them on the outside. So, for example, Johnson was in May's cabinet for quite a period of time before resigning, and once he wasn't in the cabinet, it caused even more problems for her. So the cabinet is a key part of the executive in the UK, and it's not just consulting the Prime Minister, it's making decisions with them and can outvote them. And the convention in the UK is that if a Prime Minister loses a vote in cabinet, then essentially at that point they should stand down. The President's cabinet comparatively has very, very little constitutional power. It's simply there to advise the President, and the President holds sole executive authority. So whilst in the UK we have cabinet government, in the US they have presidential government, and so this is a kind of key difference in the executive branches. The cabinet and all other members of the executive serve the President. There is no kind of collective responsibility. There's no actual need for cabinet meetings or cabinet agreement. If the President wants to do something, they can do it. If they want to sack someone for disagreeing with them, they just sack them. I mean, obviously a UK Prime Minister can sack members of cabinet as well, but it tends to have slightly more ramifications. Key similarities and differences between the roles of the US President and the UK Prime Minister. So I'm going to go through a series of kind of roles that sometimes both have, and sometimes it's a bit more imbalanced. So head of state, well, this is one that only relates to the President. The President is the head of state in the USA. The Prime Minister isn't the head of state in the UK. The monarch is. Now, this means the President has a stronger ceremonial role. They're more of a symbol of the nation, so particularly at moments of crisis. Whilst in the UK we might look towards the monarch, in the US they would very much look towards the President. And this then gives the President a position which is kind of above party. So even if you dislike a president's politics in the US, even if you don't agree with their party, you would still respect the position of president, and therefore, because they are your head of state, it would be treated with due deference and etc. And therefore, presidents tend to get big crowds and things wherever they go, and it's not necessarily a huge sign of partisan support. In the UK it is different, and therefore, because they haven't got that ceremonial position, above party position. Lots of UK Prime Ministers want to gain that kind of position above party, but it's fairly rare. Next role is that of chief diplomat. Both the Prime Minister and the President take a lead role in international relations and negotiations with other countries or supranational organisations, things like the UN or NATO or things like that, or the EU. Now, both actually have other people kind of who play a key role there. So the Secretary of State in the US, the foreign minister in the UK. Both are also restrained by their legislatures. The Constitution is less clear exactly where Parliament steps in the UK. It seems to be a lot clearer in the US, but even in the US there's kind of a bit of confusion about where the role of the Senate stops and the role of the President holds, and it's worth having a kind of a look at that, and in particular the role of the President in foreign policy is a key aspect of that I've covered in a previous video. The President holds the position of Commander-in-Chief. Now, because they are the President's forces essentially, and the President commands them. In the UK, the Prime Minister essentially does the same, but they are Her Majesty's armed forces. That prerogative power, however, is passed on to the Prime Minister. The monarch doesn't actually go and command the army or the navy or the air force. And again, military action and is restrained by the legislatures in different ways. And again, there's similarity. It should really only be Parliament in the UK that declares war. It should only be Congress in the US that declares war. In terms of the role of chief legislator, the power is much stronger in the UK. Well, the Prime Minister is actually in the legislature, is normally got a majority behind them. So in terms of directing and running legislation in the UK, the Prime Minister's position is a uniquely powerful one. Now, the President can kind of mandate to this kind of power, but they might face an awful lot more opposition in the legislature than a UK Prime Minister would, particularly if they're dealing in divided government. This, of course, changes with circumstances. If you're a minority government or coalition government, then things are a bit different. Now, in terms of comparing the power, so we've looked at roles, but actual power, this is one that can be a little bit odd. And it can change in terms of from your initial perception, actually, to when you look at it in a bit more detail. And one of my favourite quotes about this is the one near the top of the screen at the moment. It is the US president is often seen as the most powerful person in the world, but not necessarily the most powerful person in America. And this is again because of the differing nature of the US president's power on domestic and on foreign policy. So on foreign policy, they tend to have large amounts of power, and so the rest of the world, people like us in the UK, will look at it and go, well, the American president seems to do everything. They're enormously powerful, and America is the most powerful nation on earth. Therefore, they're really powerful. But if you don't look at their political system, look at the president trying to actually pass a piece of domestic legislation, then there's lots of people who seem to have a lot more power and say over it, whether that's the majority leader in the House or whether it's the majority leader in the Senate. And it's quite difficult for a president, particularly in divided government, to actually really get much done. So the Prime Minister actually seems more powerful, and this seems to be particularly the case when it comes to passing legislation. An example of what I've just been talking about. So Boris Johnson has got a majority of 80. So if he wants to pass a new piece of legislation, then he can do it. But if we go back a little bit in time when we look at Trump 2018 to 2020, well, Trump faced a Democrat-controlled House. So if Trump wanted to pass a piece of legislation, tough. Essentially, the Democrats in the House would just block it. And there were actually very few examples of bipartisan work and actually getting things done. Obviously, that can change with circumstances. The Prime Minister also has much stronger powers of patronage than a president, and the president can offer perks, can offer. I'll come and speak in your state on your behalf in your district in your election. Come and have a flight with me on Air Force One. Let's have a nice lengthy phone call, and you can tell everybody you've been on the phone to the president. But nothing really concrete. I mean, they can offer jobs in the executive if somebody wants to leave Congress. So in the UK, it's a lot more direct because of the fusion of powers, because the cabinet and the Prime Minister sit within the House of Commons. Then MPs are more likely to be loyal to the Prime Minister than members of Congress are. There's more that the Prime Minister can do to hinder their political careers. There's more that he can do to help it. Now, there is an argument, however, that actually US politics is becoming more and more partisan, and we're seeing some of this in kind of some aspects of the Republican Party are showing a kind of undying loyalty to Trump, even though he's no longer in power. And so that kind of fealty to the political leader seems to be something on the increase in US politics, in a way that it's getting a bit more similar to the UK. Congress is much more likely to be affected by public opinion because of the short nature of their terms. So because they only have 2-year terms, they are more likely to turn on a president if it's going to be to their advantage. They're more likely to back a president if it's going to be to their electoral advantage. So that kind of connection with the people is because it's more frequent in the House of Representatives. That means it is more likely to reflect public opinion. So whilst public opinion about a Prime Minister might change quite substantially from their early days having just won an election to the last few months of their term in office, then Parliament within that tends to stay fairly static unless there's a huge run of by-elections. But it is very different in the States, where it changes every 2 years. Now, whilst I've argued that some parts of what's happening in America seems becoming more British, there's definitely aspects of the way our prime ministers act, which is becoming more like the US. So prime ministers arguably are becoming more presidential. They're taking greater control over the executive. So if there is a dissenting voice, then a prime minister is unlikely to tolerate that in their cabinet. So when we saw this with Javid, when he was chancellor, and he wouldn't accept changes that the prime minister wanted to make to his team, and therefore he was gone. We've also seen a lot of this under Johnson, where there's really extensive powers and influence put in the hands of special advisors, such as Dominic Cummings. And also, if we look at the way, particularly our media deals with elections, UK elections have become much more US-like in the level of focus on the party leaders. We tend to have the leaders' debates, and lots of people, if you talk to them, will go, "Oh, I voted for Johnson," or "I voted for Corbyn," and you're thinking, well, unless you lived in their constituency, no, you didn't. And there almost seems to be a kind of demand to be more like the US. I think it's because it's easier to capture in a media way of doing it. It makes it easier on the front pages to have Johnson versus Corbyn, etc., than it is to have party against party and all the different MPs. Whether there's going to be a demand in the UK for a move to an elected president, I'm less sure. That is not to say in all of this that the presidential power is not great, because there are some clear arguments, and again, I've looked at this in previous videos, looking at the interpretation and debates of the presidents. There's this idea of an imperial presidency, and this is the theory that presidents have expanded the power of their own power and the power of the executive, and are starting to act without Congress and essentially outside what was their original constitutional limits. And a president can do more without Congress than a prime minister can do without Parliament. And so there are things like executive orders and executive actions and signing statements that a president can do to kind of mould what's going on and drive things from their position ahead of the executive that a prime minister can't. A prime minister has to use Parliament in most cases, but the prime minister is more likely to be able to use Parliament than the president is used to use Congress. So it's a bit of swings and roundabouts. But there is the idea of the imperial presidency, is an idea that the power of the US president hasn't gone. As I mentioned earlier, the UK Prime Minister faces a much more difficult position with their cabinet, which is their first amongst equals. So that power struggle can be very damaging to a UK Prime Minister, and they can lose a vote in cabinet. There is no need for cabinet to vote in the US. They are just advising the president, so that the president doesn't face that same problem. When in the UK the Prime Minister doesn't have a majority, they are in a weaker position to a US president operating in the same kind of circumstances. So when we saw May and then Johnson acting in the UK without a majority, they were essentially unable to do anything. And they then get hammered for it, because in the UK we are used to seeing prime ministers just being able to do what they want to do, and so they look incredibly weak. Whilst in the US it's not quite the same thing, because they are used to watching a divided government and therefore a president getting blocked by Congress. There is this added threat in the UK of a vote of no confidence, and that can actually end a government. Recently May and Johnson operated in these circumstances, and government came to a grinding halt. We had the bizarre situation with Johnson, where Johnson kind of trying to provoke a vote of no confidence, essentially go on, force an election, I want an election, and almost playing chicken with the opposition on that, which is not normally how these things are expected to work. On the flip side, you do on occasion get presidents who have majority in both houses, and therefore in that way they would seem as powerful as a UK Prime Minister. So Bush, for a large part of his presidency, Obama at first in his, even Trump at the beginning of his, though he didn't seem to quite get the momentum out of that he should have done. The Prime Minister also has a much weaker claim to a national mandate than the US President, especially if they've been made Prime Minister by an election, by a leadership election rather than a general election. And part of that is because the President can say things like, I've won the Electoral College or I've won the popular vote, whilst a UK Prime Minister's party is likely to have got early 40s%. When a US president had as low, I think it was Clinton, at about 45, that was considered to be incredibly low, which is more than the Conservatives got in the UK general election in the last election that we've had. So circumstances can play a big role when comparing powers. The impact that the Prime Minister and President have in their country, then, in some ways, again, we've got some similarities. So you say, well, they both dominate politics in their country. I mean, if a President or a Prime Minister holds a press conference, all the media turn up. It's on national TV, it's on the radio, it's in the newspapers. So they're heads of government. They set the political agenda. So they say, this is what we should all be talking about. And if the President or the Prime Minister starts talking about it, then that tends to become the national agenda. However, both can be blocked by their legislatures. They both come to power through elections. It's more direct in the US in that there is a presidential election, whilst in the UK there isn't. So there's a bit of difference there, but you can say there's also a similarity. They are both elected. They tend to dominate the legislatures in terms of the legislative programs, but the Prime Minister has more of an impact on legislation than a President normally does in most circumstances. Parliamentary sovereignty minimises control the judiciary have over the Prime Minister, particularly because, again, if a Supreme Court in the UK says something the Prime Minister's done is unconstitutional, then they can just put an Act of Parliament through Parliament and change the Constitution. It's not the same for a President. You'd have to amend the Constitution, and that is something that the President is kind of beyond the President's control. These 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the states. The President has more power over their cabinet. So although they both have cabinets and they both are head of the executive branch, the power of appointment of a president is far more wide-ranging. One of the barriers a lot of UK prime ministers come against, Thatcher complained about it, Blair complained about it, and the way you can see Johnson complaining about it in the way that he's used his special advisors is they've got this permanent civil service sat there, a meritocratic thing rather than by an appointment, and therefore they often find that there's people in high up positions in terms of running the parts of the executive that are there permanently, and they don't get to change them, whilst a US president can make about 5,000 different appointments. The extent of accountability to the legislatures, again, there's some similarities and quite a lot of differences in this, and I've mentioned some of these already. So the Parliament can remove the PM through a vote of no confidence. Congress can't do the same, though they can impeach. And we've seen it. We're currently seeing, as I'm making this video, we're seeing that about to start for the second time for Trump. Accountability is greater in the US. You can argue there's more need for compromise. A lot of this depends on the arithmetic in Congress. So you might have to work with the opposition party, and you have to work with other parts of the legislature in a way that you don't have to in the UK. It all seems like a big show in the UK, that they make lots of noise and they shout at each other. But if you got the votes, you got the votes. Whilst in the US, a president trying to get something done is probably going to have to try and persuade some people of the other party. And that accountability is heightened by the separation of powers. Both face scrutiny and oversight, particularly from committees in the two legislative branches. And again, a lot of that looks very, very similar. The Prime Minister, however, faces question time on a weekly basis, and this is something that a president doesn't. So again, that would be a difference. The Senate can block presidential appointments, whilst Parliament can't. So in the next bit, I'm going to look at some of the different approaches to kind of assessing the differences and similarities between the Prime Minister and the President. So one method you can use is the rational approach. Now this seems to be the most obvious one to use, because it's about individuals and individuals working in their own self-interest. So obviously the Prime Minister and the President are individuals who are able to fairly large extents to pursue their own self-interest, and then you could talk about the different limitations that are placed on them. So it kind of interacts with the structural approach to a fairly high degree. The Prime Minister has more power of patronage with the legislature due to the crossover with the executive and legislature. So you are more likely to become a member of the cabinet if you've been a good, loyal MP supporting the Prime Minister over big issues, and maybe for a long period before they become Prime Minister. Presidents really lack this same kind of control, but they make much larger numbers of executive appointments and able to remove those who oppose them. Again, if you look at the list of different appointments under Trump, it's quite enormous in terms of this chopping and changing there. Again, you would probably see even stronger criticism, or you would see even stronger criticism in the UK if a Prime Minister was getting through their cabinet quite so quickly. They'd also have an awful lot of very angry people sat on the back benches, which would make their life very difficult. They would have to fear the reprisal from backbench MPs in the way that a US president doesn't have to really fear reprisals from sacked members of cabinet, maybe apart from a few blasts in the media, but it's not quite the same as having them sat behind you in Parliament for maybe years and years afterwards. So the rational approach is a good one, and you could talk about how far the president can get done what they want to do, how far the Prime Minister has the power to follow their own self-interest. So that one works quite nicely. The cultural approach is a really interesting one, I think, with the Prime Minister and President, because one of the things we have to remember is that they are members of a political party. And to lesser or greater extents, they are the leader of that party. Now, in the UK, they absolutely are. Whether they are the leader of the party in the US is probably slightly more up to the debate, but they definitely come across as that to the public. The harder bit actually in the US is who's the leader of the party who doesn't have the current president. Now, all the different political parties have kind of values and ideologies and ideas that binds them together to a certain extent. Now, this might be ideas, I don't know, let's say of equality in the Labour Party in the UK, or law and order in the UK Conservatives. It might be the idea of small government in the Republican Party, or social justice in the Democrat Party. And again, you can argue about what exactly the values and ideologies are of the different parties. And again, I've done videos on that for both the US and the UK. Now, therefore, is the president acting through a rational way, through their own decisions, or are they following a party line? And there can be kind of shifts in culture, and all this can affect how a president or prime minister acts. So, for example, Cameron calling the Brexit referendum, he didn't want Brexit. We saw this with the fact he resigned afterwards. But the culture of Euroscepticism within the Conservative Party, parliamentary party, and particularly amongst its membership, kind of pushed him along those lines. So he was acting on a culture. The cultural approach, therefore, is more appropriate than the rational one. Now, the culture of a party can be shaped also by a prime minister or president. So you could talk about Blair having shifted the culture of the Labour Party. You could talk about Trump shifting the ideas and approach of the Republican Party, and that's something that's been hotly debated in America at the moment. Now, parties in both countries have factions, different groups within them. Now, it's more the case in the US that they are more broad tent parties, and therefore they tend to be more internally divided, and there isn't the same kind of ideas of party discipline as there is in the UK. And part of this is structural, it goes down to the parties. But this is a really important cultural thing as well. And we're seeing very much the divides in the Republican Party being played out following Trump's defeat in 2020. And so, again, the next leader, the next kind of presidential candidate for the Republican Party, are they going to be swept along by the culture that's produced by Trump, or the more traditional Republican culture, and where's that going to take them? And Biden as the kind of the leader of the Democrat Party, there are the more moderate Democrats and there are the more progressive Democrats, and so he has to try to get, because he's got quite narrow majorities, he needs to be mindful of both sides or both ends of his party in terms of getting stuff through Congress. So we might see stuff that goes through Congress which is not necessarily completely in line with what Biden would want, but he needs to go in that direction to keep his party unified, keep it together and get it through the houses of Congress. The structural approach is always interesting with US and UK politics, because obviously one of the fundamental things that makes them different is the way that they're structured, the way they're set up by their constitution. And this is a really good way of looking at their differences and similarities in their roles and powers. The separation of powers in the US gives much stronger barriers to the president acting, and then that kind of feeds into the rational stuff as well in terms of them following their own self-interest. The fusion of power in the UK means that there is less structural restraint on the Prime Minister, and therefore again feeds back to the rational approach where they can follow their own self-interest. Circumstances do vary with all of this. A Prime Minister can expect first past the post to deliver them a majority in the House of Commons, even if they don't have a majority of the vote in the country. Whilst most presidents face at least some of their term, particularly normally after their first mid-term, with the opposing party controlling at least one of the houses of Congress. The other bit, the structural difference, is not only to do with the legislature, it's also to do with the judiciary. The Supreme Court in the US also wields much more power due to the difficulty of amendment and the circumstances in which Supreme Court judges are appointed. So if a Supreme Court judgment goes against the president, there's not a huge amount they can do about it. Whereas if a Supreme Court judgment goes against a UK Prime Minister, if they're really determined, then there is, because they can pass Acts of Parliament and they can get it all changed. So I hope that's been helpful for you, and looked at the similarities and differences in roles and powers of the UK Prime Minister and the US President, and also the rational, structural and cultural approaches to looking at these different ideas. As I said at the beginning, this is part of my playlist on A-level politics, also part of my playlist on US politics. If you found this helpful, then please hit the like, and also make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, so as I add more and more videos you'll get told about them. If you've got any questions or queries, then please leave something for me in the comment section. Thank you very much for watching.